Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has been the only true worldwide superpower. Now, the modern world is full of potential superpowers, like China and India, but in the 1980s, people widely thought that a different country was destined for this world superpower status: Japan. Within only a few decades, Japan went from utter devastation to becoming the second largest economy in the world, and were projected to become a new economic superpower on par with the United States itself. And then it didn't. Japan fell into a recession, and now no one even entertains the idea of Japan rivaling the US, or China for that matter. But the real impressive story is how Japan rose to become a major world power in only a few decades. Twice. So why did people think Japan was destined to be the next world superpower? Why didn't it? And how did it get from this to this in such a short time? This video is sponsored by Fabulous. In the 1630s, Japan's Tokugawa shogunate issued a series of decrees that completely closed the country off from the outside world. No one could enter and no Japanese citizen could leave for over 200 years. This period of isolation would become known as Sakoku, or locked country, and it came as a sudden change of character to a Japan that had previously sent traders and embassies all across East and Southeast Asia and even as far away as New Spain. One common explanation for these decisions was the continuing encroachment of foreign powers like Spain and Portugal and the gradual spread of Catholicism, which the Edo-based government saw as a potential threat and possibly a pretext for a Spanish or Portuguese invasion. And so, the country was closed. This theory, however, has been challenged by modern historians, and in fact the narrative of Japan being completely isolated from the rest of the world for 2 centuries isn't completely true either. In addition to a small Dutch factory on the island of Dejima in Nagasaki's harbor, Japan also maintained a strong trading relationship with China, though which was mostly restricted to the island of Kyushu. Nonetheless, while shoguns like Tokugawa Yoshimune encouraged the so-called Dutch studies, this would be Japan's only formal contact with the Western world, as the Western world itself went through a series of dramatic changes. The United States of the 1850s was one that had started to exert its might as an independent power, mostly by stealing a crap ton of land in Mexico, and beginning to grow its power in the Pacific. In 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry and his 4 black steam-powered ships arrived in Japan, bearing a message from President Fillmore, they became the first non-Dutch Westerners to be allowed into the country ever since it was closed. This was not the first attempted expedition to Japan from a foreign power, but it was the first successful one, being granted a meeting with the Bakufu, or the Shogun's court, which the Americans assumed was the imperial court. It actually wasn't. The actual emperor was over in Kyoto while the Shogun held the real power. Reportedly, the court organized a sumo match as a display of pure Japanese strength and machismo, an event the American delegates only found laughable. The Americans, in turn, assembled a small 100-meter railway with a quarter-scale locomotive, showing the technological progress the Western world has made, with Japan having missed out on the Enlightenment and most of the Industrial Revolution. The Tokugawa government was forced to sign the Convention of Kanagawa, ending its period of isolation. 4 years later in 1858, Japan also signed the Harris Treaty, which, along with similar treaties from the British, Dutch, and French, mandated Japan open certain ports to foreign trade and gave extraterritorial rights to any of their citizens in Japan, meaning citizens of these countries did not have to follow Japanese laws while in Japan. You're kidding! You mean I still have to wait 3 more years to drink sake? You know the drinking age in America won't be raised to 21 for another 130 years, right? Shut up, Dutchie, I bet you dip your fries in mayonnaise. Without a shot being fired, Japan ended up in a similar position to China after the recent Opium Wars, forced to sign asymmetrical treaties purportedly on the basis that Japan was a non-industrial, non-constitutional, non-modern power. Japan referred to these treaties as the unequal treaties, and sought to bring an end to this humiliating status quo. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was a dramatic shift in power that saw the Japanese emperor once again overthrow the shogun as the true leader of Japan. Unlike previous revolutions of this kind, however, this one came with a series of reforms so significant it actually affected the average person. Most Japanese power shifts of this sort didn't affect the average person all that much, though the Meiji Restoration, named for the emperor in question, had much more drastic effects on the country. The government enacted the Charter Oath, or 5-article oath, with 5 pledges: to establish deliberative assemblies in order to involve the public in decision-making, to involve all levels of society in the affairs of the state, to abolish restrictions on the occupation and function for all people, to abandon the superstitions of the past and embrace rational laws of the future, and to seek knowledge from around the world to strengthen Japan. Japan reorganized its government with a formal constitution, sent envoys around the world, and grew its army and navy to a truly gargantuan size. Eager to establish itself as a true world power, on par with those of Europe, Japan set its sights outside, first on the Ainu and Ryukyu Kingdom, then Korea and Taiwan, and then into a now much weaker Qing Empire. However, another power also had plans for Korea and Manchuria: Russia. Russia had been expanding into Manchuria and at least Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula, just west of Korea. The 19-month Russo-Japanese War resulted in a victory for Japan, the first time a European colonial power was defeated by an East Asian power, with Russia forced to abandon its expansion efforts in East Asia. Through a world war, then a big-time SAD, and now allied with the worst regime to ever exist, Japan continued to grow even further. Japan spread across the Asia-Pacific region, committing unspeakable atrocities in their wake across China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Their aggression, however, eventually resulted in the United States joining the war, and once Germany and Italy had capitulated, Japan was left on its own, refusing to surrender until... When the dust had settled and Emperor Hirohito declared via radio that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, which is a huge freaking euphemism if I've ever heard one, reactions among the ordinary folk were mixed. Many were either ashamed at Japan's loss of the war, fearful of what the Americans might do to the country and the people, or even hopeful of what could be a change for the better. In part of his speech, the emperor called on the Japanese people to endure the changes that would inevitably follow. Japan was virtually left in ruins by the war. Cities had been destroyed, hundreds of thousands killed, and the once powerful empire cut up and disbanded. Japan was put under military occupation under the Allied powers, with the responsibility of reconstructing Japan largely falling to American General Douglas MacArthur as the supreme commander of the Allied powers, or SCAP. Officially, this occupation was under the multinational Far Eastern Advisory Council, though in practice it ended up a mostly American-run operation. In MacArthur's mind, the problem lay mainly in Japan's over-centralization, militarism, and fascism, and as such, his agenda focused primarily on increasing democracy and demilitarizing the country. The title of emperor was kept in place, albeit in a much more limited fashion, something which seemed to many, both at the time and ever since, like a terrible idea. However, the goal with this decision was to keep a sense of continuity and to prevent the people from turning against the occupation. While the emperor was made to publicly renounce his divinity, MacArthur still received strong criticism for keeping him out of the Tokyo trials, which saw many of the wartime government's top leaders tried and sentenced. The military was also disbanded, which required around 7 million former soldiers be brought home, as was the special hire police, the so-called thought police of the wartime government. As many as 200,000 government officials and businessmen were removed from their posts, in an attempt to transition Japan away from their fascist administration. MacArthur also wished to dissolve the Zaibatsu corporations, companies which had notable influence over the imperial economy, convinced they had operated the wartime economies of Japan's colonies, but this wasn't completely successful. Often those Zaibatsu that were dissolved simply reformed around the banks that replaced them, now known as Keiretsu, including the likes of Fuji, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Nissan, and Sumitomo. In October 1945, MacArthur tasked legal scholar Matsumoto Joji with assembling a committee to rewrite a new constitution for Japan, preferably before the first meeting of the Allied Council of Japan in December, because the Soviets would be there too. Matsumoto's committee, however, concluded that the emperor should keep his sovereignty over the country and just not exercise his power that much, something which MacArthur found completely unacceptable, and asked Major General Courtney Whitney to draft a more appropriate document. They then presented their draft to the Japanese authorities, who, likely through a miscommunication, adopted and passed it with almost no alterations, assuming it was meant to be the final draft. Passed by the emperor as essentially an amendment to the Meiji Constitution, The 1947 constitution transferred leadership of the country over to the people instead of the emperor, who was to be a merely symbolic figure. It also guaranteed rights to the people based on the American Bill of Rights, and, most controversially, forbid Japan from developing any sort of war potential. Basically any army or navy building that isn't solely devoted to Japan's self-defense. Japan, however, still needed to reform its image on the world stage. Possibly the most consequential figure in the Japanese government at that time was Yoshida Shigeru, who served as prime minister on and off for the first 8 years after the war. The Yoshida Doctrine emphasized rebranding Japan's infrastructure and economy, relying on America's military strength as they were not allowed their own, and also emphasized economic diplomacy on the world stage. An accomplished diplomat and a student of diplomatic history, Yoshida once remarked, "History provides examples of winning by diplomacy after losing in war." The Allied administration also allowed the establishment of political parties, though in practice many of these were simply rehashings of older parties, with some exceptions, namely the Japan Socialist Party, which won a modest 18% of the vote in 1946. But then the next year they won 28% of the vote, alarming SCAP and setting forth a dramatic purge of 13,000 accused socialists from politics and business, even going as far as to reinstate many of those who had previously been purged from the wartime government, and ending their campaigns against the Zaibatsu corporations. The administration also went on somewhat of a union-busting spree, with union membership nationwide decreasing from 50% to 25% by the 1960s. As Japan emerged from the rubble, the new government invested heavily in coal mining and iron and steel manufacturing, becoming the second most profitable steel industry in the world by 1959, partly through demand from the nearby Korean War. This also had the knock-on effect of drastically boosting the shipbuilding and auto manufacturing industries. Japan became the largest shipbuilder in the world, and, as the average income steadily rose, also became the second largest car manufacturer. And with the populace becoming richer, so too did demand skyrocket for consumer goods. Being under the US's sphere of influence and not being allowed to grow its military, Japan never had to spend much on its armed forces. And having been behind most of the world in technology, it also didn't have to spend much on research and development. As the 20th century progressed, Japan's economy started to grow to astronomical levels. While Japan's rapid growth during this time was far from unique, it was certainly one of the fastest, and many even started to predict Japan's rise as the next world superpower. It had a high population, a huge GDP, and an economy growing so fast that it was projected to overtake the US as the world's premier economic superpower. And then, it didn't. An economic bubble started to form in 1986, as real estate and stock market prices were drastically overinflated. Homes were often so expensive that families bought out multi-generational loans to pay them back. And according to some reports, the Imperial Palace, if it could be sold of course, would have been worth as much as the entire state of California. In 1991, that bubble finally burst, and with drastic mismanagement from national leadership, caused a recession that would last until 2002. This era is known in Japan as the Lost Decade, and it was marked by anxieties of Japan's place in the world. While the recession didn't result in a Japanese Great Depression, it did signal the end of the post-war economic miracle, as well as any realistic aspirations for outperforming the US. As Japan's growth started to slow, it was also overtaken by another emerging East Asian superpower, China. While China now seems poised to join the US in superpower status, the idea of who is and isn't a world superpower is incredibly vague at best. Japan, however, has definitely taken over the world in another way. Not politically or economically, and certainly not militarily, but if this were a game of civilization, they have definitely won themselves the cultural victory. Whether you want to sleep better, concentrate more, or just live a healthier life, building new habits to improve our lives is something probably most of us have tried. But unless you have some sort of superhuman will, it doesn't always work out. That is where Fabulous comes to play, an app designed to help you build new habits and change your daily routine for the better through small steps that can gradually lead to big changes. Fabulous is like a little digital trainer to help you change your daily routine to live happier, healthier, and more productive. You can do this either by picking and choosing which specific rituals to perform at a certain time of day, Rituals like drinking a glass of water in the morning, or not looking at your phone at night, or taking some time out of your day to learn something, which I've been doing. Or if you want a bit of a more guided experience, you can also check out one of their curated journeys. Changing old habits and building new ones can be hard, but Fabulous can help coach you to better, healthier habits that actually stick through daily itineraries that are 100% personalized and based on behavioral science. Join the community of 30 million users worldwide and start building your ideal daily routine. The first 100 people to click the link below will get 25% off a subscription to Fabulous.